So in the last lecture, you learned how to get the data from the server. Now let me show you how to take this application to the next level and add the ability to create a new post. So here we have a text box. I can add the title here, my new post, enter, and now it appeared here. And also, behind the scene, we sent an HTTP post request to JSON placeholder to create this post on the server. So back in the template for post component, I'm going to add an input with the class form-control. Now, you want to handle the key up event. So key up and also apply a filter, enter. So when the user presses enter in this text box, you want to call the create post method. And as an argument to this method, we want to pass a reference to this input field. So let's add a template variable here, title, and simply pass that to this method. Now back in our component, let's implement this new method. So create post takes the title. And once again, it's good practice to annotate this because this parameter title is not a title object or a string. It's an HTML input element. So we want to avoid confusion for other people reading this code and also improve compile time checking. So this is an HTML input element. Now here we need to call the server. Once again, we need to use this HTTP object here. But this object is currently only available in the constructor. So I'm going to decorate this with the private keyword. So it will be a field in the class. And then here in the create post method, we can call this .http. Now instead of the get method, we're going to use post. And this will send an HTTP post request to the server. So we have a few different types of HTTP requests. Each request has a verb that determines the type of action. We use HTTP get to get data, HTTP post to create data, HTTP put to update data, and HTTP delete to delete data. Now let me show you one simple way to remember this. In HTTP put, we have you, and also update starts with you. So this is how I remember the difference between HTTP post and HTTP put. Now we also have another verb that is HTTP patch, and we're going to look at that later. So to create data, we need to send an HTTP post request to the server. So here, once again, as the first argument to this method, we need to pass the URL. So I'm going to do a small refactoring here. I don't want to duplicate this URL in two places. Instead, I'm going to declare a private field here, private URL. Why private? Because this is only for the implementation detail of this class. Nowhere outside this class, we want this field to be visible. Okay? So I'm going to grab this URL here, cut, and set it here. And then in HTTP get, I'm going to pass this .url. And similarly, in our create post method, I'm going to pass this .url. Now, as the second argument for this method, we need to pass the body of the request. When calling HTTP services for creating data, the body of the request should be a JSON object, and that's the object we want to send to the server. So I want to create a post object here, like this. This post should have a title, and the value of this title should be the value we have in our title input field. So title.value. Now, I don't quite like this code because look, title is set to title.value. It's a little bit weird. So I would rather to change the name of this parameter to input or title input. I prefer input because input is shorter, right? So now we have a post object. And of course here I've set only one property because this is a simple application. In a more complex application, you might have to set multiple properties, or more realistically, you might have multiple input fields. So instead of one text box for adding the title, you might have a form. So then you get the JSON object behind that form and then send it to the server. Okay? Now, as a second argument here, we need to convert this post JSON object to a string. So we use JSON.stringify, which is a native object in JavaScript. Here we pass the post object. Now look at the return type of this post method. This method also returns an observable of response. So all the methods of the HTTP class return an observable, which means here we need to subscribe to this observable, and we'll get the response in our subscription function. So here we add response goes to code block. For now, let's just display this in the console. So console.log response, and we want to convert this to JSON. Okay. Now let's test this. Back in the browser. Here's our new input field. I'm going to add Mosh, enter. Now look at the console. This is the object that we get from the server. So this object has only one property, and that's ID. That's the ID of the new post. In a real-world application, when we send an HTTP post request to the server should respond with a complete representation of the newly created object. So instead of one ID property, it should have all the properties of the post object. But because here we are working with a fake service, this is purely for demonstration purposes, not a real API. So back here, I'm going to get the ID that we get from the server and add it in the post object. So post.id, we set it to response.json.id. Now here we have a compilation error because this post object we created earlier doesn't have an ID property. Now there are two workarounds here. One way is to set the type of this to any, and then TypeScript will not complain about this anymore. The other way is to use the square bracket notation. So instead of accessing this property using dot notation, we use square brackets. As far as I know, there are no differences between these two approaches. So now we have a post. Finally, we need to add it to our posts array so we can see it on the view. So this.posts, we can call the push method, but with this, our post will appear at the end of the list. If you want to add it at the beginning of the list, you need to use the splice method. So splice, the first parameter is the starting position. So 0. The second parameter is the number of objects you want to delete. In this case, 0. And the third parameter is an object you want to add at the starting position. So here I want to add this post object at index 0. Okay. Now finally, let's clear the input field. So once we set this post object, then we can set input.value to an empty string. Let's test the application. So Mosh, enter, and now it's in the list. So to create data, we use the HTTP post method.